The egg cracked on a Tuesday. Nobody was watching. Orin, the four-armed Sealy diplomat who owned the egg, was 3 decks above, arguing with a docking authority over a permit that should have been stamped 6 hours ago. The egg sat in a cargo crate lined with heat cloth, and it cracked, and then it cracked again, and then a small gold head pushed through the shell like it had somewhere important to be. The hatchling blinked. Her eyes were copper-colored and very large. She looked at the cargo hold. She looked at the crate. She looked at the broken shell around her, then stepped out of it and shook herself, scattering small flakes of gold membrane across the heat cloth. She was about the size of a house cat. Her scales were pale gold, almost white near the wingtips. She folded those wings close, sat down in the middle of the crate, and waited. Orin found her 11 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back at him with those enormous copper eyes. He crossed all 4 arms in something between surprise and joy, then walked over very slowly, the way you approach something small and new and unsure of the world. She did not move away. When his lower left hand came close enough, she bumped her head against his knuckles. He named her Sorai, right there, in the cargo hold of his courier ship Ring Whisper, and tucked her into a sling he made from a spare equipment strap. She rode against his chest for the rest of the day, watching everything. That was how it started. The hatchling was 17 days early, and Orin had no plan for her yet, but she seemed unbothered by this. She seemed unbothered by most things. She simply watched. Ring Whisper was a small ship with a small crew, 4 beings total, running diplomatic mail and observer duties along the neutral trade lanes near the Dera Belt. It was quiet work. Orin liked quiet work. He was the kind of diplomat who believed that showing up and saying nothing useful was still better than not showing up. The priority alert came in 4 hours after Sorai hatched. A ship called Ardent Passage had broadcast a distress code from the edge of the Dera Belt. The code was civilian, not military. Orin pulled up the vessel records and found a colony ship, registered human origin, carrying 4,000 passengers on a long-haul transit to a settlement destination in the outer corridor. Surrounding it were 12 Vathari warships. The Vathari were one of the oldest species in the galactic conclave. They were tall, gray-skinned, very organized, and very certain that the rules of the conclave existed primarily to benefit beings who had been around long enough to write them. They had 12 warships and a containment sphere around a single civilian ship, and in their minds, this was a reasonable response to a permit violation. Orin looked at the distress code. He looked at the fleet number. He looked at Sorai, who was watching the alert screen with her copper eyes, tracking the data lines the way young things track movement. As a neutral observer delegate, he had no legal choice. When a civilian vessel was at risk of destruction, a registered witness had to be present. He told his pilot to change course. The journey to the Dera Belt took 6 hours. Orin spent most of it reading the conclave file on the incident. The Vathari position was clean and official. The humans had attempted to settle a world inside the designated expansion corridor in violation of the boundary accord they had signed 11 years ago. The Ardent Passage had been intercepted and given terms. The file did not say what the terms were. It did not say whether the humans had responded. Sorai slept for 4 of the 6 hours, curled in her sling, making small sounds that Orin could feel through his chest more than hear. When she woke, she climbed to his shoulder and stayed there, watching the viewport as the stars shifted. When Ring Whisper dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the belt came into view, Orin saw the full picture for the first time. 12 Vathari cruisers, each longer than a city block, arranged in a perfect sphere around one ship. The Ardent Passage was smaller than any one of them. It trailed a thin stream of coolant vapor from a cracked line near the rear exhaust. Its hull was not new. It had the look of a ship that had been traveling for a long time and had handled the distance without complaint. It looked tired. It looked like it had no intention of going anywhere it had not decided to go. Orin logged Ring Whisper's arrival as a formal witness and opened a channel. On his shoulder, Sorai made no sound. She simply watched the colony ship with her copper eyes, steady and still, the way she had watched everything since the moment she cracked out of her shell. Orin had raised 3 hatchlings in his life. He knew the look they got when something caught their attention in a deep way, not curiosity, something older than curiosity. Recognition. He filed it away and said nothing. The channel opened. Admiral Gull's face appeared on the screen, grey and formal and entirely certain of the outcome. Orin introduced himself. Gull acknowledged him with the thin courtesy one extends to a witness one did not invite. Through the viewport, the ardent passage drifted, quiet and stubborn, inside its cage of warships. Soar watched it and did not look away. The man on the other screen had engine grease on his left hand. Orin noticed it right away. He noticed things like that. It was the hand of someone who had been inside a machine recently, not sitting in a command chair. The man's name was Davan and he was, according to the records Orin had pulled, the chief engineer of the Ardent Passage and its current acting representative, because the civilian governor they had departed with had died 2 months into the journey from an illness that the ship's medical bay had done its best with and failed. Davan looked like a man who had not slept well in weeks. He also looked like a man who had stopped expecting sleep to come and had made his peace with that. Admiral Gull spoke first. He was very good at speaking first. The terms were as follows. The Ardent Passage would power down all propulsion systems within the hour. Navigation cores would be surrendered to a Vathari technical team for secure transport. Passengers and crew would be transferred to a Conclave-designated relocation vessel and taken to a refugee processing station in the Outer Ring. The colony world they had been heading toward would be placed under quarantine flag. The Vathari would file this as a resolved incident. Gull delivered all of this in the tone of someone reading a list he had read many times before. Davan listened. He did not interrupt. When Gull finished, there was a short silence. Then Davan said he would need 24 hours to explain the situation to the passengers and prepare an orderly handover. He said it calmly. He said it the way someone asks to be handed a wrench, not the way someone begs for mercy. Gull had offered 24. Davan took it without negotiating for more. That was the thing Orin noted in his personal log afterward. Most beings, given an impossible situation and a deadline, either pushed back on the deadline or collapsed into it. Davan did neither. He took 24 hours, the way you take exactly the amount of time you already knew you needed. Orin watched Davan's face on the screen. Soar, still on his shoulder, was watching it too. There were small things in Davan's expression that most species would miss. Orin had spent 40 years reading faces across a diplomatic table, and he could see the quiet calculation running behind the tired eyes. Not fear, not despair. The particular focused stillness of someone who has done the math and knows what comes next. When the channel closed, Serath spoke. Serath was the Vathari intelligence officer who had come aboard Ring Whisper as an additional observer. He was younger than Gull, precise in the way of someone who had been trained to be precise, and he watched everything with eyes that were always processing. He said the humans were probably destroying data, buying time to wipe navigation records and any evidence of how long they had known about the colony world before the accord was signed. Orin said that was possible. Serath looked at Soar. The hatchling looked back at him with those copper eyes, flat and steady. Serath looked away first. Inside the Ardent Passage, which Orin could not see but would later piece together from accounts, the 24 hours began. Davan moved through the ship after the channel closed. He was not running. He walked the way someone walks when they know every centimeter of the floor under them. He stopped in the engine corridor where his pilot Ro was waiting. Ro was a compact woman with short grey hair and the economy of movement of someone who had been flying ships since, before some of these warships were commissioned. She and Davan spoke in low voices. The words were quiet enough that the ship's own ambient noise covered them. What was visible to anyone watching was that they spoke for about 4 minutes, and at the end of it Ro nodded once, and Davan nodded once, and they went separate ways. A child walked past them during this. She was about 8 years old, eating a ration bar, wearing mismatched socks. Her name was Marat. She stopped and looked at Davan and asked if everything was going to be okay. Davan said yes. Marat looked at him for a moment, the way children look at adults when they are deciding whether the answer is worth trusting. Then she nodded and kept walking. Back aboard Ring Whisper, Orin sat with his report open and could not decide what to write. The facts were clear. A human colony ship had been intercepted, terms had been given, the acting representative had accepted a compliance window. Everything was proceeding in the ordinary way that these things proceeded. And yet, he looked at Sorai. She was sitting on the console edge, facing the viewport, facing the ardent passage. She had been sitting in that exact position for 2 hours without moving. He had never seen a hatchling this still before. He wrote in his log, the human representative accepted terms without resistance and without visible distress. His demeanor was consistent throughout. I could not identify any behavioral marker indicating deception, submission, or negotiation strategy. He paused, then he added one more line. I am not certain what I observed. I am certain I have not observed it before. He saved the log and looked out at the ardent passage, drifting in its cage, the thin trail of coolant catching the starlight like a thread. The 24 hours had begun. From the outside, the ardent passage looked like a ship going quietly to sleep. The power readings on Serath's instruments dropped in sections, one cluster at a time, the way a building turns off its lights floor by floor. Cargo bays sealed, sensor arrays folded inward. The ambient heat signature from the engines cooled steadily. Everything the Vathari instruments were trained to watch for, signs of charging weapons, burn preparations, emergency broadcast attempts, showed nothing. Serath watched the readings for 3 hours, then he watched them for 3 more. By the 9th hour of the compliance window, he had a feeling he did not like and could not name. He pulled up the power reduction sequence on his display and ran it again. The numbers were all correct. The ship was complying. The sequence was clean and orderly and followed the exact pattern the Vathari technical team had specified in the handover document. It was too orderly, that was the thing. Human ships, in his experience, never went quiet in a straight line. There were always spikes and dips as different crew members worked at different speeds, forgot steps, repeated them. This sequence was smooth, automated smooth, programmed smooth. He mentioned this to Orin. Orin, who was feeding Sorai small pieces of dried fruit from a bag, said that sounded like good compliance discipline. Serath said that it did not sound like 4,000 scared civilians. Orin had no answer for that. Inside the ardent passage, which neither of them could see, it was quiet in a way the ship had not been quiet in months of travel. Davan moved through Deck C, then Deck B, then down into the lower residential corridors. People were in their rooms. Families were together. Some were asleep. The medical bay had completed a series of what the ship records called routine pressure check sedation procedures for the youngest children, a precaution against abrupt changes in atmospheric conditions. The language in the log was careful and technical and accurate. What the log did not say, because logs do not record the quality of silence, was that the ship felt the way a held breath feels. Davan placed his hands flat on the hull near the core coupling junction, a section of wall that ran along the main resonance conduit. He closed his eyes. Around him, the ship hummed in a register below what most ears could catch. Not the sound of engines, something older than engines in this ship. The sound of 4,000 people in their rooms and corridors and medical bays and observation decks, all doing the same thing at the same time. Being still, being present, paying attention in a direction that had no physical location but felt, to anyone practiced in it, as real as a compass needle. Ro was at the pilot's console on the bridge. She was not flying. Her hands rested on a sequence of 6 controls in a particular arrangement. She was counting, not aloud, but with the slow precision of a metronome inside her chest. She had run this count in simulations 40 times over the past 6 months. She knew the number she was waiting for. At the 14th hour of the 24-hour window, she reached it. Aboard Ring Whisper, Serath's instruments made a sound. It was not an alarm. It was the sound instruments make when they receive data that contradicts the data they received 1 second before. A soft, confused tone. Every reading from the ardent passage dropped to zero, not in sequence, not gradually. Every sensor contact the 12 Vathari ships had maintained for the past 14 hours simply stopped at the same instant as though the ship had been switched off at the source. Serath sat forward. Orin looked up from Sorai. The copper-eyed hatchling had gone very still on the console edge. Her scales were doing something that Orin had not seen before in a dragon this young. They were shifting color, the pale gold cycling through subtle variations, almost like the surface of something trying to find a frequency. Gull's voice came over the channel, sharp and controlled. He demanded a status report. His 12 ships began broadcasting active scan pulses at maximum range. The pulses returned nothing. No debris, no heat bloom, no particle trace, no faster-than-light exit signature, which would have shown a distinctive energy curve that no known cloaking device could mask. The containment sphere of 12 warships held its formation around a volume of space that contained now only starlight. The ardent passage was gone. Orin stood up. He walked to the viewport and looked at the place where the colony ship had been. It was an ordinary piece of space, a few drifting dust particles in the belt, the faint smear of a distant nebula behind it. Nothing else. Sorai made a sound. It was small and low, a harmonic note from somewhere in her chest that Orin felt in his back teeth. He turned to look at her. She was facing the empty space where the ship had been, but her head was slightly angled, tilted about 15 degrees to one side, as though she was tracking something that had moved. Not gone, her posture said, in the language that has no words. Just somewhere else. Orin stood next to her for a long time without speaking. Outside, the Vathari fleet continued to scan. Their instruments continued to find nothing. Their pulses went out and came back empty and went out again. Sorai kept her head at that 15-degree angle and did not move. 3 hours after the ardent passage disappeared, Ring Whisper received a message. It came in on the diplomatic courier channel, tight beam, encoded with the standard neutral observer encryption that Orin's ship used for sensitive witness communications. The sender ID was registered to the ardent passage. The message was 4 words long. Orin read it. He read it again. He closed the message window and sat with his hands folded on the console for a long time. Then he saved the message to his private log, encrypted separately, and told no one. Outside, the Vathari fleet was not handling the situation well. Admiral Gull was a man who had operated on certainty his entire career. Certainty of rank, of force, of the fundamental principle that a civilian ship with damaged systems and 4,000 ordinary people aboard did not simply stop existing in front of 12 warships. He had fleets of analysts and sensor techs, and they were all telling him the same thing in different technical language. The ship was not here. It had not gone anywhere measurable. It was not here. Gull requested Ring Whisper's sensor logs from the 30 seconds surrounding the disappearance. Orin, bound by witness protocol to provide evidence to any party involved in the incident, handed them over. Serath reviewed the logs in Orin's small conference room, sitting very straight, going through the data at quarter speed, and then 8th speed, and then frame by frame. Orin sat across from him and said nothing. Sorai sat on the table between them and watched Serath with the focused attention of a creature with excellent pattern recognition and no politics. The logs showed the ardent passage. Then they showed the ardent passage. Then they showed a frame in which the sensor recording was blank, not corrupted, not noisy, simply blank, a single missed frame. Then they showed empty space. Serath watched that frame for a long time. He said quietly that he wanted to propose a theory. Orin said he was listening. Serath said, what if it was not stealth? What if the ship did not hide? What if it moved, but moved in a way that leaves no signature because it does not use any mechanism our instruments are built to detect? Oren said that was an interesting theory. Serath said that if it was true, the Conclave had a significant problem, because the entire framework of galactic law around ship tracking, border enforcement, and military response was built on the assumption that all known travel methods left a detectable trace. If humanity had found a method that did not, then every border, every blockade, every containment action in Conclave space was operating on a foundation with a crack through the middle. Oren said he would note that in his witness report. Serath looked at him, Oren looked back. The moment lasted a few seconds longer than comfortable. The Conclave emergency session was convened on long-range relay that same day. The council voice opened with the question everyone wanted answered. Had humanity developed a weapons-grade stealth system, and if so, what were the implications for Conclave security? Oren was asked to give his witness account. He described, in careful and accurate language, what he had observed: a civilian ship, a compliance window, a disappearance with no detectable trace. He did not describe the forward message. The session went in circles for 6 hours. Species that had invested heavily in tracking and enforcement technology were alarmed. Species that had historically been on the receiving end of Vathari blockades were notably quiet but notably attentive. The council voice called for a containment review of all human-registered vessels in Conclave space. Several delegates seconded this. Nobody mentioned that the ship carrying 4,000 civilians, including children in mismatched socks, had been surrounded by 12 warships for attempting to go somewhere and live there. Oren noted this in his private log, not his official one. Sora had stopped watching Serath. She was back at the viewport, facing the same direction she had faced since the ship vanished, 15 degrees off from the last known position of the Ardent Passage, not toward it, towards somewhere else. Oren had begun, quietly, to note her bearing in his personal records. Each hour, he logged the direction she faced. It did not change. On the 4th day, one of his crew, a young navigation tech named Lev, mentioned that if you drew a line from Ring Whisper's current position in the direction the dragon kept facing, it passed through a sector about 30 light-years away that contained a system that had been officially surveyed as uninhabitable. Oren said, "Which survey?" Lev checked, Vathari survey, filed 19 years ago with the Conclave. Oren said, "Thank you, Lev, and pull the original survey data for me." Lev did. Oren looked at it. Then he looked up the human-filed survey of the same system, which had been submitted to the Conclave 5 years after the Vathari one, and then quietly noted as a duplicate and archived without review. He read both surveys. He closed both documents. He sat very still, in the way that Davan had been still on the screen, the way that Sorai was still at the viewport, the particular stillness of someone who has done the math. He opened his private log and wrote 3 sentences, then he deleted them, then he wrote them again. Then he fed Sorai a piece of dried fruit and looked out the viewport in the direction she was looking. 30 light years, officially uninhabitable. He thought about 4,000 people trusting one tired engineer. He began writing a very different witness report from the one he had been drafting. 6 weeks passed. Sorai grew. Dragon growth in the first year is not subtle. She had doubled in length by the end of week 2 and doubled again by week 5. Her scales had deepened from pale gold to something richer, amber and ivory, in shifting patterns that caught the light differently depending on the angle. Her wings, folded, covered most of a console. Her eyes were still copper, but had taken on a depth that was harder to look away from. She had also, somewhere in the 4th week, started making sounds. Not the small harmonic notes of the early days. These were structured, layered, low enough that you felt them in the walls of the ship before you heard them with your ears. She made them only when facing the direction she had faced every day for 6 weeks, the direction that Lev's line passed through, 30 light-years out, toward a world that an official Vathari survey said could not support life. A xenolinguist arrived on week 4. Her name was Breen, a Seelie like Oren, and the conclave had sent her at Orin's request without being told exactly why. She spent 2 weeks on Ring Whisper with recording equipment and a great deal of patience. At the end of week 2, Breen filed her report. Soar was not producing language. She was not speaking to anyone aboard the ship. What she was doing, Breen wrote, was responding. The pattern and rhythm of her vocalizations were consistent with the second half of a conversation, specifically the replies, not the opening statements. She was answering something that the ship's instruments could not detect and that no other being aboard could perceive. The conclave classified Breen's report within 4 hours of receiving it. They did not classify it quickly enough. Orin had read it already. Serath, who had stayed aboard Ring Whisper longer than his orders technically required, came to Orin 3 days after the classification notice arrived. He did not mention the report. He sat down across from Orin in the same conference room where they had reviewed the sensor logs, and he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he asked about the dragon. Orin said Sorai was doing well, growing fast. Serath asked what she was looking at. Orin said he did not know. This was not true. It was the first deliberate untruth Orin had told in 40 years of diplomatic work, and it sat in his chest with a specific weight. He filed that weight away and kept his expression neutral. Serath looked at him. Serath was very good at his job. He knew that Orin was lying. Orin knew that Serath knew. They sat with this for a moment. Then Serath stood up, thanked him for his hospitality, and left the conference room. The next day, his transfer request to a diplomatic post went through internal Vathari channels. Orin heard about it from Lev, who had a habit of monitoring fleet communications out of professional curiosity. Serath had requested reassignment from intelligence to observer work. He had cited, in the private section of his transfer form, that he did not know was accessible to a diplomatic channel with the right clearances, a change in his professional assessment of where the most important work of the next decade would happen. Orin read this and felt something he rarely felt, hope in a form he had not expected. He turned his attention back to his documents. In the 6 weeks since the Ardent Passage disappeared, Orin had been building a picture from old files and public records, and the kind of cross-referencing that most people did not bother with, because the documents existed in different databases that officially did not talk to each other. The Vathari survey of the colony world was 19 years old. The lead surveyor had retired 8 years ago. His retirement package, cross-referenced with public financial records that Orin had no particular reason to pull, except that he was thorough, was significantly larger than the standard retirement for his grade. The human survey of the same world, filed 5 years after the Vathari one, had been submitted through the proper conclave channels, flagged as a duplicate system entry, and archived without a review hearing. The human delegation at the time had formally requested a hearing twice. Both requests were tabled. The human survey described a world with a breathable atmosphere, liquid water in the northern band, soil compositions suitable for agriculture, and an average surface temperature that a human would find comfortable in summer clothing. The Vathari survey described a world with toxic trace gases, no stable water surface, and surface temperatures lethal to most carbon-based life. They were describing the same planet. Orin sat with this for a long time. The Boundary Accord, signed 11 years ago, had been built on the foundation of conclave survey data. Every territory map, every expansion corridor designation, every world declared off-limits to human settlement had been drawn using data that someone had decided was correct and someone else had decided not to check. He was not certain it was a conspiracy in the deliberate sense. Bureaucracies did not always need malice. Sometimes they only needed the quiet, habitual assumption that the people doing the checking already knew the answer they were going to find. Sorai landed on his shoulder. She had started doing this in the 5th week, when she was large enough to be slightly too heavy for it, but did it anyway, and Orin did not object. She put her head near his ear and made the harmonic sound, soft and close. He had heard it directed outward toward the viewport for weeks. This was the first time she had directed it at him. He did not know what it meant. He suspected it meant something like, "You already know, stop waiting." He opened a new document. At the top, he wrote, "Supplemental Witness Report, filed under Galactic Observer Protocol 7, with attached evidence." He began to write. He wrote for 4 hours without stopping. When he finished, he reviewed it once, made 2 small corrections, and prepared it for transmission to the full conclave, not the council voice, not the Vathari chair, but every registered member species simultaneously, which was his right under Protocol 7, and which he had never used before in 40 years. He attached the 2 surveys. He attached the financial record. He attached Breen's classified report, which he had the right to reference as a first-hand observer who had read it before classification. He attached his own 6 weeks of logged observations, including the daily bearing of a young dragon who had not looked away from a specific point in space for a single day, since a ship full of humans had gone somewhere the conclave said was impossible. He transmitted it at 3 in the morning ship time, when Sorai was asleep on his console and the rest of the crew was off shift. Then he went to the viewport and looked out at the direction she always looked. 30 light years. He thought about the 4-word message he had never told anyone about. He thought about Davan's tired eyes and certain hands. He thought about a child eating a ration bar in mismatched socks, asking if everything was going to be okay and accepting the answer before it was finished. He thought that perhaps the most dangerous thing humanity had was not what they could do in a physics sense. Perhaps it was that they had looked at a cage and simply decided together that it was not permanent. He went to sleep. Sorai kept watch. The conclave did not respond to Orin's report immediately. This was expected. The conclave moved the way large things move, with significant momentum in whatever direction it had already been going, and changing that direction required more force than most beings were willing to apply. But it did respond. 41 hours after Orin transmitted his supplemental report, the full session convened on long-range relay, not the emergency session with the council voice and the same 12 delegates who had been talking in circles for 6 weeks. The full session, every registered member species, 104 delegates on screens arranged in the conclave's standard formation, which looked like a sunburst if you mapped it, and a controlled argument if you listened to it. Orin sat in his small conference room with Sorai on the table beside him and gave his account. He described the boundary accord. He described the 2 surveys. He described the financial record of the retired Vathari surveyor. He did not call it fraud. He described it in precise, factual, documented language and let each delegate draw their own conclusion, because conclusions that people reach themselves are harder to dismiss than conclusions handed to them. He described Sorai's 6 weeks of continuous, unbroken observation of a specific point in space. He cited Galactic Observer Protocol 7, subsection 4, which stated that uninterrupted draconic observation, when logged and witnessed by a registered neutral party, constituted a binding secondary record equivalent in legal standing to instrument data. This subsection existed because dragons could not be bribed, pressured, confused by technical interference, or persuaded to face a different direction. They were the oldest neutral witnesses in the known galaxy. Sorai had been watching for 6 weeks, every day, logged by Orin, witnessed by Lev and the rest of Ring Whisper's crew. It was in the record. The conclave could suppress Breen's classified report. It could dispute Orin's reading of the surveys. It could not suppress a dragon. The session lasted 9 hours. Orin answered questions. He was patient and specific and did not raise his voice once. When it was over, he set a course for the coordinates at the end of Sorai's line of sight. 30 light years. Vathari survey, uninhabitable. Human survey, home. Ring Whisper arrived 4 days later. The world was green. Not the dull green of algae on rock or the pale green of scrub desert. Green in the way of a planet that had water and sunlight and soil that wanted to grow things. The northern band caught the light in the early hours and came up gold-green through the viewport, and Orin sat in the pilot's chair and looked at it for a long time before saying anything. He hailed the surface. Davan answered. He was wearing the same jacket from the comm screen 6 weeks ago, now with an additional stain near the collar that looked like it might be soil. He looked less tired. He did not look surprised to see Orin. They agreed to meet at the landing site. Davan came up in a small atmospheric shuttle, the kind colony ships carry for surface work. He and Orin met at the edge of the landing pad, which was a cleared area of flat ground surrounded by the early stages of what would eventually be a settlement. There were structures going up, simple and practical, the kind of buildings people put up when they are focused on function first. There were people moving between them, working. It had been 6 weeks. They had not been idle. Orin asked about the 4 words. Davan said, "We sent that message the moment we arrived. We wanted you to know it worked." Orin asked how it worked. Davan was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the settlement, at the people moving between the half-built structures. Then he looked back at Orin. He said that humans had a theory, developed over about 30 years by people in a field that every other species considered too strange to fund. The theory was called resonance bridging. It was built on the idea that consciousness, under the right conditions, had a measurable relationship with the geometry of space, and that if enough conscious minds focused in the same direction at the same time with sufficient clarity and trust, they could create a fold, not a jump, not a tunnel. A fold, like pressing 2 points of a piece of paper together, so the distance between them stopped mattering. He said the hard part is not the physics. The hard part is the trust. You need everyone. You cannot have a single person thinking it will not work, because doubt is not just a feeling, it interrupts the resonance. We spent 6 months practicing, every person on the ship. Children, elderly, sick people in the medical bay, everyone. Orin said, the little girl, Marit. Davan said, especially her. Kids are actually better at it than adults. They haven't learned yet to be skeptical of things that feel impossible. Orin thought about that for a while. Soar, who had ridden down on his shoulder, climbed off and stepped onto the ground of the new world. She spread her wings slightly, amber and ivory, catching the local sunlight, and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she folded her wings and sat down in the grass and put her nose close to the ground and breathed in. From across the settlement, Marit appeared, carrying a small trowel and wearing the same mismatched socks. She stopped when she saw the dragon. She walked over slowly, the way Orin had walked towards Soar's crate on the day she hatched. When she was close enough, she reached out her hand. Soar bumped her head against Marit's knuckles. Marit sat down in the grass next to the dragon and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say. Orin watched them and then looked back at Davan. He told him about the conclave session. He told him about the surveys and the retired surveyor and the archived human report that had been filed and ignored twice. Davan listened. His face went through something complicated and then settled into something quiet. He said, we knew, not all of it, but we knew enough. Orin said, the conclave is going to argue about this for years. Davan said, let them, we have a planet. Orin thought about the 104 delegates and the 9-hour session and the bureaucratic machinery of the known galaxy grinding through the implications of a world that was not supposed to be habitable being very clearly inhabited. He thought about Soar, who had watched this world across 30 light-years for 6 weeks without anyone asking her to. He filed his final report that evening from Ring Whisper's console, with the settlement visible through the viewport and the sound of people building things carrying faintly through the hull on the night air. The forward message was in the final report. He included it as evidence of arrival confirmation, which it was. He also included it because it was true and because Orin believed, after 40 years of diplomatic work, that the truest and most important things were the ones that fit in the smallest number of words. We are still here. Below, in the grass near the landing pad, Soar made the harmonic sound she had been making for 6 weeks. Here, on this world, in the dark and the quiet, Something in the resonance of the ground itself seemed to answer her. She had been the only witness to what humanity had done. She decided she would not be the last.